Welcome to the Pánsá Pánsá Forum. In the Yoruba language, the word Pánsá is usually injected into poetry to express an uncomfortable, uncensored, and inconvenient truth. The Pánsá Pánsá Forum is candid conversations about the life of African immigrants in America as it relates to their adaptation to their new home. While some may find it easy to integrate and can balance between retaining the original African culture while accepting the culture of their new home, many continue to struggle to find a balance between both worlds.
Hello and welcome to Pánsá Pánsá Live. This is a podcast where we discuss the lives of African immigrants and their assimilation into Western society as they raise younger generations in a country that is quite different from their own. We also explore the experiences of children of immigrants as they balance the African and Western cultures. I am your host, Baba, and together with the founder of Pánsá Pánsá and my co-host, Ms. Kemi Sariki, we present to you this informative, interesting, and expansive dialogue about the intricate experiences of African immigrants in America.
So welcome to Pánsá Pánsá. I'm your host, Kemi Sariki, and today we have Ms. Zuleka Dauda joining us today about a self-published book called Baya Play Cook, an Anthology of Short Stories. The book is a collection of true life stories from the country of Liberia, West Africa, a compilation of stories of abuse, rape, and molestation of women and children. Ms. Zuleka, welcome to Pánsá Pánsá Live podcast again. It's wonderful to have you here today. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, that you're going to share your experience as first-generation African who grew up in America with our audience. And we're also going to talk about your book, your childhood experience before you migrated to America and your experience after migration. Can you fully introduce yourself? Talk a little bit about your background to our audience as to where you were born, where you spent most of your childhood and adult life.
My name is Zuleka. As you said, I am a full-time graduate student, a doctoral student here in Virginia. I spent most of my childhood in Liberia, West Africa, as you said. My father is from Sierra Leone, neighboring Liberia, and my mother is Liberian. I second or the last child of two girls to a mother, a single mom. I study international affairs and I'm a writer. I hope to use the stories that I tell to shine another light on Africa, the continent. I think African stories need to be told by Africans because in the past, a lot of times there's this Western view of what Africa is and what African culture is, and we need to dispel that myth. I am a student, so a lot of times, a lot of the things I do is focus on education, educating people, shining the light on things Africa related. I spend a lot of times on social media and online trying to share our stories and share our avid reader. I enjoy sharing African literature and African stories. I think we're losing the art of the old school stories of, sitting around the fire hard and hearing those stories. So I hope that we can continue those. Hence the new book that I wrote was little short stories where I incorporate some, like a little story time, but it's real things that happen to people that I weave into these conversations so that we can make these conversations more general and try to advocate for change.
Thank you for that. And what are you studying?
So my doctoral study is in governance and globalization. I'm specifically looking at how Africa and Africans are represented in international programs in American schools.
Oh, wow. That's great. That is wonderful. We're going to make changes through that. That's what I'm talking about. Yes. So your family migrated as a result of civil war in Liberia. What was the experience like as a child who was exposed to violence at the time? Was there any psychological effect and emotional trauma you experienced, and can you expand on this?
Yes, obviously, I think the trauma associated with war is something that we take for granted. But I was 8 when I saw my first body, and I say this all the time. I still remember I was 8 years old during the 1996 Civil War, because Liberia had a long civil war and there was different times. The first one I remember was in 1990, but I was too young to remember that. But then the 96 one was the first one that I actually experienced. And I remember waking up in the middle of the night. There's a story in this book where it talks about the war and people waking up and running. And that's essentially my story, where I remember waking up in the middle of the night and having to pack our clothes and put it on your head and run, and you hear the guns, but you don't know where you're going, and you see people coming from all different directions. I remember seeing my first body, and there was a guy laying on the floor So I know that specifically. And I think some of the long-lasting trauma of Liberian War is that I don't like fireworks. And it's going to be July 4th soon. But I like to see it, but I don't like I get startled easily by firework. I'm not very fond of firework. And also I live in Virginia, so they have shooting range, people go and practice to shoot and stuff like that. And I've been, and I feel like a lot of times when I'm around guns or when I see guns or those sort of things, like I don't know if there's happy memories of guns, but I don't have any good memories thinking about that. I remember child soldiers and people my age holding guns and some of the things that are associated with that. So I don't have any sort of memories of the war that I can say I want to remember. So I think for me, dealing with that was to repress those memories. I try not to remember them every so often, like April 6th. Every year, sometimes I remember some of the things that I went through. The last war was 2003. And luckily, I would say, because that's just sheer luck or blessings from God, that my family was able to migrate during that war. And that one was one of the deadliest war where it happened so fast and so short time. And that was in a city where there was a lot of cutting of limbs and all of those things that you see and hear about. So I think for me, the long psychological thing is I don't like fireworks. I don't like war, even movies. I try to watch happy movies. I don't like war movies, violent movies, because it just transports me back to those times where you were just hiding. Even with COVID now, when everybody was inside and isolated, I just remember there were times where 2-3 days you couldn't leave your house because people were shooting outside. You were afraid of stray bullets.
I don't know whether you know Biowu. She was
Nyemade Biowu. Yes.
She's an advocate. And at that time she came to United States. She had a talk. I even bought a book I have on my shelf that I read at the time. And I met up even personally at Columbia University when she came here to make presentation. How she described it. No child should be able to see that.
It was very brutal. In parts of the country where they didn't have enough older people, they just recruited younger people who they killed their parents and then they drugged them and made them do things. So these are people who are my friends or cousins or people who you know. So it's very, and I still think like over all these years, even though Liberia has been in a peaceful state for over 14 years now, thank God, but there's still this violent nature of younger people and people that when you hang around, sometimes I think about, and I think the war really did have a lasting effect on a lot of us.
That is sad. And you say your dad is from Sierra Leone.
Yes, my father.
And there's also Sierra Leone war too, that took place over there.
Yes, it was a spillover from the Liberian War as well. And the former president, Charles Taylor, was tried in the international court because of crimes in Sierra Leone. So the two countries do have some intertwined history, yes.
So when your family migrated to US, did you and your family receive therapy to address the traumatic experience of war?
No, we did not. I think as an adult, as an older person now, yes. At some point in college and going, I had to do that specifically for my own mental health. And because I was studying psychology, so I understood the significance of that. But as a family, no, we did not.
So after you migrated and your family settled, what are some of the challenges and the struggle of being the first generation African immigrant child? What are the benefits of growing up in an immigrant home?
I think I would talk about the benefits first, because I think the benefits is living in between these two worlds. Like I had a bit of Liberia home. When I come home, I am in Liberia because we have the food, you have the people, the conversation, the language and everything. And then you go to school, then there's America. Or when you go to the bus stop. So I think the benefit is living in between these two cultures and trying to navigate the two. Almost like you put on a mask when you go out, you come home. Liberians refer to the way Americans talk as series. So sometimes we say it's so exhausting and tired to be out speaking series all day. When you get home, you're excited to just talk in your mother's tongue.
It's like code switching.
Yes, exactly. So it's nice to switch codes when you get home. But I think some of the challenges for me definitely was the adjustment of not knowing if it's not a vacation. So you're not going home, putting on this new persona, this new way to talk, this new way to fit in, because it wasn't cool being African. It's not like now people are a little bit adjusting. It was very hostile, where people had this one-sided view of what Africa was, which was the Maasai culture or huts or the safari or something. So it was very one-sided and negative. There was nothing good about being African. So I think the challenge for me was trying to fit into a place where I was seen as an odd person, and then also trying to fit in and not have to hide who I was. That was very challenging because you want to wear African clothes, or bring African food, and then you hear people condemning or saying things about that. So I think it was kids being kids, but also it was coming from a place of this Western notion of what Africa is and this American ignorance of not knowing anything outside of here. Yeah. So I think it was a challenge, but it was also an opportunity to share light on the place that I love, the people I love, the food and things like that. So yeah.
Yeah, it's true because, the misconception as well as the ignorance, it is so common, not only among the children, also among the adults. I've had adults ask me if I speak Africa before.
Yes.
And I said, there's over 2,000 languages in Africa, and within each language is different dialects as well.
Yeah.
So, and I don't speak Africa. Or how does it feel to live inside a hut, a mud house? Sometimes I crack it like a joke, like, mud house is actually for the rich people. I was living inside trees, just to put them and said, can you imagine someone saying that in this day and age of not understanding? I'm talking about before the internet. Pick up a book and read and educate yourself about other people's culture or where they come from.
Yeah.
How would you summarize your identity as it relates to your dual identity, African identity and Black experience, knowing that you came from a country where formerly enslaved African Americans settled?
I think for me, the connection between Liberia and America is one that is stained. I like to say it's almost like Liberia is like a stepchild that was never acknowledged. I think a lot of African Americans or Black are not aware of the history of Liberia and the history that Liberia have to enslaved people. So that's part of some of the things I do online is to share light and let people understand that this happened and share some of the history. But I think as a Black person, I used to say I never knew I was Black until I came to America, because when you're in Africa, I was just Liberian or I was Pele. That's my mother's tribe. Like I didn't have to face what my race was until I got here. And then you're forced into this bubble or this box. Mm-hmm. And I can't keep saying I'm African, I'm Liberian, because when you were faced with law enforcement or with a lot of different things, you were just Black. And so you were forced to face this Black experience. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, living in between this Black identity and this African identity sometimes, it's both challenging and beneficial. As I said before, it's beneficial because I get to switch between the two, and some people don't have that opportunity. But it's challenging because they're both not good connotation. Like African is always negative to a lot of people, which I hate because it's such a vibrant, as you said, over 2,000 languages, different people, different faces. We have people that look as white as snow, and we have people that are very dark. Mm-hmm. So there's this multiplicity of identities that people just don't have conversations about, and they always just fit us into one bubble and say, oh, like, can you speak African? Or, oh, you're African, I'm not African. And or say, when you go to Africa, I want to go to Africa. It's like, where do you want to go? What specific place? So I think for me, it's just this constant, almost like I have to be on the offense all the time, trying to get people to just know these things and about African. And then being Black in America is such a struggle, as you've seen. It's like almost like you have a target on your back. If you're not dealing with racism, you're dealing with stereotypes. It's a constant struggle, even between Africans and African Americans. There's this rift about, oh, I'm not African, or I'm part African, or I'm 1/3 African or something. So I think there's a lot of, almost like I'm on the defensive most of the time with both of my identity, which is a challenge, but it's also, I like it because I get to talk about my identity a lot.
It's part of what we have to go out there and continue to educate. And it's so sad that we have to educate even the people we share the same heritage with. As people of African descent, it's part of struggle. Even ordinary, like I said, many of you were brought here at a very young age that you could code switch from your African accent to American accent. Sometimes it's very challenging mentally that you have to go through that. And even if you could code switch, it's as if sometimes even they look at your name, they say, oh, this is like a foreign name. This person is not from here. That is another kind of discrimination or biases that you have to face also from people of the same color as you. So there's a need for this education that has to take place. And I'm glad that you are involved in that and you continue to do what you have to do to educate people. I was reading one of your blog essay called Wakanda Is Not Real. There was a part of that essay that it struck me, and this is how it goes. You said, so here I was, an ashamed Liberian, leaving my country for US to escape from the USA in my own country, and I had to rebuild my life. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, like I said before, being a young person and packing up everything, like your friends, you already have a network of people. And then you were just tossed into this place. When my family came, we came to Rhode Island, which is in New England, apart from the weather adjustment, just adjusting to this whole new culture of people trying to rebuild everything, because when I came in 10th grade. That is the second step in already high school. So students are already formed their friendship, their network. At this point, you have to get used to a new school system. You have to get used to how teachers teach. Almost like I was just born again somewhere else. You had to get used to all of these things. And then you had, like you said, on the side, you had to keep listening to people say you have a foreign name. Where are you from? When they find out it's Liberia, they don't know where that is. Then you say it's Africa. Then when you put it in Africa, then they say something negative. You have to dispel that. So it was a lot of that, trying to build something for myself. And like I said, ashamed because you don't want to be that. A lot of times I remember going to camp here for debate. At the time, I was very good at speaking and public speaking. And my mother sent me to debate camp. Yeah. And so when I went to debate camp, I remember it was in Vermont, which is like middle of nowhere, New England. And then I was with a lot of other people, but Black American. From the outside, we all look the same. You think it's this. And then you get to your name to other places and they would constantly say like, nah, man, I'm not African. Or I don't know where she's from. Like, I'm not that, I'm this. And I said, where are you from? They would say New Jersey. And I said, yeah, but where are you from? And trying to understand, they said, what do you mean? I'm just Black. And that was my first encounter of just Black. And I'm like, what does that mean? What does just Black means? And trying to understand the multiple of identities in America, they all come with their own connotation. Mm-hmm. So I think for me, I was younger, much younger. So I was ashamed of being that because if I wasn't from New Jersey or California or something, I wasn't cool enough. There was this factor that I was trying to be. And I was neglecting who I really am, which now, like a lot of these people, and I say this all the time jokingly, I say, these people who used to make fun of me are the same people who now ask me to bring clothes back from Africa for them, the same people who are now, so I'm like, I think that it came full circle in a way where I'm glad that I'm still around to experience this shift in mentality for some people, but we still have a long way to go.
It's a long way. It is a really, really long way. So I understand there's all kinds of names that they call you, bully you about, saying African Buddhist scratcher, go back to Africa, where many of all these things that you experience growing up in this country, and also many of African youth who were brought here, or even those ones who were born here, that they could understand that, oh, okay, you are not part of us, even though you were born here, because they could identify through the name, but you're denying them of their rights and their citizenship. And that's the education that is actually needed, that we need to expand on. And I understand for the past 2 years now, there's been a Back to Africa movement called Return in 2019, in which Africans in the diaspora are encouraged to come back to Africa to settle and invest in the continent. What do you think about the movement?
Yeah, I've heard a lot about that. I think I'm very excited that the conversations has started. Mm-hmm. I think it's way overdue, but I'm excited about the conversations. I think when done correctly, which is not just for tourist attraction to just come and see. I think if there's a historical educational factor to people from the diaspora coming home, like the group that was going to Ghana and seeing where enslaved people were taken from and seeing the last point of return where people left from and tying that history. I think that's a great initiative. I think if African Americans can then see that Liberia was founded for this reason, and people from here in Virginia where I live, the American colonization, they left, they took people back, even though when they got back, they recreated exactly what people did here, which was the indigenous people that were there. They took advantage of them. There's a lot of history there that people need to have this conversation about, because a lot of times it's one-sided. And some people think Africans sold their fellow Africans and took them away, when in fact there was different conversations. Even when Africans returned back to the continent, there's still this privilege. So I think people from the diaspora still have to recognize their privilege of going to Africa and being a part of this conversation, being a part of rebuilding some of the things. There's still this colonial legacy in Africa that we need to address, that it's not just all whatever is, like when you go to Bahamas or you go to the Caribbean, they show you like nice things and beautiful things, the blue water. But when you talk to a native from there, I understand how colonial legacies still remain in the Bahamas, how the people local people do not live the way you live when you're on the resorts, then you understand. So I think it's a similar conversation that needs to be happening with the diaspora. I'm all for the movement of people going back to Africa, and not to say people are going back to take over or claim, because there's still, again, like I said, history of colonialism in Africa. So they have to be wary of their presence. Coming from America, you are no longer, even if you're Black, you still represent something. Like you have privilege, you're a Westerner, and you coming to local people, land and space. You got to make sure you're not hugging up too much of their energy and their space. You have to make sure that you're willing to have conversation and learn from these people. I think one of the things that I hope to do in my lifetime is to continue to connect universities here with universities on the continent where people can have these dialogue and conversation and learn from African students as much as, because most times it's one way where African students, they say, oh, the American students know so much and they come to Africa. And I think they can learn a lot from African students as well.
Yeah, which is very important. And I'm glad you went into the history of how Liberians, the African Americans who came back to Liberia and to migrate back in the early times, and also with Sierra Leone. People in Sierra Leone, they actually came from England. Mm-hmm. And then they look at the local people, at the natives, as if they are uneducated.
Civilized,
they are primitive. And you're bringing the same kind of mentality, colonial mentality on the continent, and looking down at the people that you came to meet over there without learning anything from them, without understanding. And for me, is to be able to say we have a lot of more African immigrants here, whereby we could start connecting with each other, with African American or other people of African descent who came from the Caribbean. Because, we have to find a way, how do we connect with one another here first? How do we appreciate ourselves, among ourselves here first? And then learn from one another, learn about each other's struggle. So when we go back to the continent, we know what we are looking at. We know whether even other people who are coming over there to take advantage, we know how to correct the situation right there before they come and take over the space. And I wanted to talk more now about your social life and your academic life in college. Yep. How do you navigate through social life in college? Did you struggle fitting into the predominant culture in college, especially coming from an African immigrant home?
I think by the time I got to college, I had adjusted a little bit because, like I said, I came 10th grade. So I had 10th, 11th. High school was a bit tougher because, like I said, I just got here. So that was a little harder. By the time I got to college, I had navigated the system enough that I was privileged to go to a good institution, and I was doing well with the school. The lesson was not as demanding as I expected, so I was doing really well in school. My social life was a balance, but at this point I had accepted that I was African. Like I wasn't just gonna be Black or Black American. I was conscious of my African identity that I wanted to. So when I got to college, I joined the African Student Organization. That was a huge part of my college life. Everybody knew me to be the African girl. I wore my head wraps. So that was important for me to make that mark. And like I said, if anything, education for me is one of the key ways that we can bridge the gap between cultures. So if you don't know me and I don't know you, so that's when I got exposed to one of my best friends from college is from Guyana, which is in the Caribbean. So I got acquainted with a lot of people from the Caribbean too. She's from New York. And every time I visited, I saw people from Haiti, the Bahamas, Grenada. So I got more exposure and I was like, wow, this is not just me being an African girl here on the island by myself. I have a whole bunch of other people here. So I actually started to enjoy America. When I was in high school, it was most just Hispanics, Africans. So you were in this big bubble of African. I have friends from Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Liberia, obviously. But then I think when I got to college, it got a lot bigger. My network was expanded. But obviously there was still the challenge of my accent. When I talk, people could still notice that you are not from here. They ask you where you're from. But a lot of times it just slap on the label, oh, she's this African girl. So I wasn't Liberian, I was just African. It was this big label that I had to carry. But I think socially, that was unacceptable and acceptable. So there was some culture, like when I hung out with the Caribbeans and everybody else from other places, it was okay. My identity was, but when I was with the Americans, again, it was always this connotation of, because you're from African, the ignorant questions of where in Africa. And then unfortunately, towards the end of doing grad school, the Ebola epidemic made it even worse because that brought more stereotypes and stigmas. And it was both good and bad. I'll say mostly on the good side. I say a lot. My college experience was a really good experience compared to my high school experience.
Yeah. Which is very good, because one thing that I always tell many African students that I come across that they are in college, I always advise them, make sure you intermingle very well, because that's how you make your connection. Don't just join African Student Association, join other associations too, whether African American or the Caribbean Student Association, and even the Latinos, because also they have the connection with Africa there. And in college is where you connect. And you could make a connection for life that will actually empower you later on when it's time to look for a job or to have contact with other people who could be the person to rely on later on in life. So when you are in campus, do you engage in a lot of other social activities apart from...
Definitely. I think, like I said, I was huge on debate. So I did join a lot of oratory competitions. I wrote, so there was some writing, writers club and creative writing aspect of that. The African club, the Caribbean student club, the dance club, they did have an African and Caribbean dance, calypso, soca. So I had, a huge exposure. My college was in Boston. So there was a lot of other colleges. It was a huge college town. So I met with a lot of different people and exchanged a lot of different ideas. We connected. I was also a resident assistant. So I got the opportunity to meet other people that way. I got a mentor who was a Black American, and he was very instrumental in me going on to grad school and continuing on to my PhD. So I think for me, I did a lot of networking in college, as you said, because I knew I did not want to stay local. Like when I was done, I wanted to do stuff and move. And right after I was done with college, I moved back to Liberia for a while. So I was preparing myself for working internationally and going back home and contributing to the rebuilding of Liberia.
That's great. That's really wonderful. It's a good thing because you learn through college, through other people's experience, then you get to move on in life. So would you say your African immigrant background influenced the way you interact with your professor? Were you intimidated to approach professors or, ask for help or even speak up in the classroom and advocate for yourself?
I would say no, because like I said, in high school, I was very intimidated when I saw students talking to teachers or when I saw people walk out on a teacher or say something. That's when I used to feel. But once I understood, because I had 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. So all of those years, I had time to understand what the dynamics was. Mm-hmm. I think for me, I was not intimidated and I needed to speak up only because I already knew my accent made people think I was not as smart as I know I am. So I had to fight a little harder to be heard. So I spoke up when I said something and I felt like a professor was being condescending or they said something, which happened a couple of times, like the first few years. But once I went to the African Student Org and other people and started understanding there, because this was a predominantly white institution. So I already understood the dynamic of race in America. So I had to speak up. I think I was not intimidated by people, but I feel like I got a lot of pressure that I needed to perform so that I can prove them wrong. So I overworked myself from both at home and here. I have an older sister who was in the nursing program. She's not a doctor. She's overperforming. So I had to keep up to do that. And so I think I felt the pressure from both at home and from the professor. So it was more of a motivation to do better.
Yeah, it is. It's a good thing. So you mentioned, being that you are doing your PhD now in planning, governance, and global program.
Yeah.
This is white space.
Yes.
Yeah. How do you navigate through this program as a woman of color in a maybe predominantly white space?
Yes, white space. I think at this point, which is, like I said, I've already been a little outspoken and loud. And I think when I got to this level, like the doctoral level, if I can't be myself here or speak up here, I don't know if there's ever going to be an opportunity to do that. So I try to connect with other Black and specifically African. If I can't find African, I say all the time, I will settle or I'll find a Black person, because it's important to find people that look like me for motivation, but also so that I don't feel like I'm isolated.
Yeah.
So I do have a Nigerian professor here that I've connected with, that I talk to, and he's very radical. We have good conversations about things that we need to do and why it's important for my studies to be here. My studies should benefit Africa, and we have this conversation. Mm-hmm. How I navigate the space, I think for me, just being here already is a part of the resistance, that I have to make sure I'm not failing so that I can stay here. So they understand African people can prove my ability to be here like any other white students that in this space. I also make it known that I've almost like I carry Africa with me everywhere I go, every meeting I go to, everything I say or do, I make sure that I bring it part of the conversation. And because in the space where people just talk about Africa like it's one monolith, like it's just, oh, you know, that's when I was in Africa, I did this work. I always check people that way and say, where in Africa did you go? When they say Rwanda, I'm like, so you should speak that way. You should say when I was in Rwanda, because I don't just say, when I was in Europe or back in America, because somebody will, it's important to do that. Or if I meet someone from church and they say, oh, I had a friend from Zimbabwe. I'm like, that is nice, but that's in South America. I'm in South Africa. I don't know anybody from there. I'm from West Africa, you know, so I make these connections and I make this conversation. I make it my responsibility to educate people, not to be rude or arrogant, but to make sure people understand that this place is huge and there's a lot. Africa have a lot to offer than people have just been taking. And I think it's time that we show that there's more to Africa than just.
And I'm glad you're saying that, because I've met many of our young African children who were born here or brought here at a young age. Somebody else asked them, or I asked them, are your parents from Africa, or which part of Africa they came from, or where are your parents from? Oh, they are from Africa. Then I have to continue to push and tell them, listen, specify which country in Africa that your parents came from. Don't just say they are from Africa. You are villagizing Africa. You need to actually talk openly and mention the country that your parents come from. And it's very important for adults to continue to push that kind of narratives, you know, and I'm glad you're doing that as well. So let's talk about your book, The Buy, Ya, Play, Cook, an Anthology of Short Stories.
Yes.
The book is a collection of true stories from country of Liberia, West Africa, a compilation of story of abuse, rape, molestation of women and children. I would say maybe the first chapter brought a lot of memory for me, because it talks about how it's actually how I grew up playing kitchen and being creative with using our own childhood imagination to emulate the adults within the community. So can you explain to our audience, what does Baya means, and from what dialect did that word come from?
Oh, so a lot of Liberians broken English, like, you know, in Nigeria, they'll say pidgin. A lot of the Liberian broken English is called colloqua. It's English, as you know, a lot of enslaved people went back. And so Liberian connection to English is, the official language is English, but they speak broken English, which is fast forward, really fast speaking, and some language or slang in there. So Baya comes from one of the slang that people, like little kids playing in the back of the house. Like you said, people play kitchen, or here in America, maybe Barbie dream house thing. That is what we used to do. And that used to be called Baya. So when someone's going behind the house to play, they would say, oh, I'm playing Baya, or you're playing Baya, or when you play Baya. So that's where that word Baya comes from. And I put play cook so people understand it's playing cook, like cooking, but not real cooking. It's like when kids cook. That's what Baya is.
Yeah, but that's what it means. So would you like to share some stories with our audience from the book?
Yeah, sure. I can share a few extras. I think specifically, like I said, the stories are, some stories are my stories. Some stories are conversations with people. Some stories are women group or people that I worked with that has shared some of these stories. Obviously, the names are changed to protect people's identity. But the content of this story is tough conversations. Like I say, people who share and support this work, I say, it's very tough to read. If you are triggered easily, or it's very tough, because but this is a real life of people. And I hope people understand that rape and molestation, a lot of times in Africa, as you just said, even with therapy, there's a lot of things we just don't do. You don't have this conversation out loud. You don't talk about it. Sometimes we go to the pastors. We bring the church involved. We have this conversation. Just one of the stories here is called The Family Way. And that's the one that I'll read the excerpt from. The reason why we say that a lot of times, even with rape, we don't go to police. We say, let's just talk it the family way. And most times we can say, oh, as a kid, you small child, don't bring that up, or you don't say those things to people. And so I wanted to have these stories out there so people can understand that that's not how people should do things. It should be conversations beyond just the family. Yeah, so this one says, at one point I told him I hated him. I hope he died. My aunt told me never to speak to my father that way again. The pastor wanted peace and continued to blame the devil. My mother was lost in her thought. I wanted her to yell. I wanted reactions she gave the gate boy for calling her big man. I wanted more from her that I never got. I know I love her barely her personality, but I needed her to be there that day. I wanted the fury that they talk about when they say hell hath no fury like a scorned woman. I wanted her to be scorned, but the only person pouring out her stories that day was my sister. So this story is about a boy his sister was raped by his own father. And they had to discuss this, but between the aunt, the pastor, and everyone else. And he was a lot of times like our mother, he was expecting much more from the mom to say something, maybe to storm out or call the police or do something. But she was just, very quiet and just, looking there. And then the aunt said, don't talk to your father that way. Let's not forget this is still your father, things like that. And as the story goes on, he says to himself, like, I can't, the only devil I saw in our house that day was my own father, the one who did this. And for me, writing those stories sometimes is hard, but I just think about how hard it must be for people like this who's living their lives, because those trauma follow you, because these things even still happen here in America, where you grew up in an immigrant home and this happens and we don't report it to the police. We don't talk about it. You're not even supposed to do that. You just go on with your life. But
they push it under the rug, because when I read that part of that story, I thought, like you said, the mother was going to say something, but she kept quiet because, first of all, the culture suppressed her voice.
Women,
the religion suppressed her voice.
Exactly.
And the idea that if she says something, this is a man who is the provider. What will be my life? My marriage is going to be ruined. I might be rejected from my family. The community may reject me. Where am I going to go? And this is part of why the abuse of women, it is so common. The domestic violence is so common back home in different parts of Africa and also among the African immigrants here. Because many times we don't say too much. We suppress our emotion. Many people, situation like that happens here, they might say, I'm not going to call the police. We're not going to report, because if we do, the whole family household may be derailed. Somebody will be charged with crime and they will be locked up. And even to the extent of being deported, whereby they say, oh, you are the one who allowed the authority to deport your father. Why can't you keep it within the family?
Exactly.
Which is part of why, like I said, I started this conversation, which I always define it to people. Pánsá Pánsá in Yoruba language means uncomfortable conversation. And there's a need to talk about all this uncomfortable conversation to educate the masses that what is not okay is not okay. Yes. And women in our culture, the culture as well as the religion oppresses and represses women's voice to the extent they cannot even come out and defend themselves or defend their children. So what actually motivates you to write the book in the first place?
I think that's why I wrote the books, for that reason, where we don't want to have this conversation. There was a lot of movement online where sometimes people, like the Me Too movement, where people will be having conversation about things that have happened to other women. In Africa, in Liberia, there is this huge problem with rape, molestation, sexual violence that we sweep under the rug, as you said, or not having this conversation. But there was this raping of like maybe a 7 or 8-year-old girl that the country got mad about, and everybody was talking about it on Facebook and everywhere else. And what struck me was the fact that every single Liberian woman that I know or was online was saying, either this happened to me or they know somebody who did. They were all enraged and everybody was mad about this. And I was thinking, how are we having this conversation publicly online, but we don't have this conversation in our homes? Why is this okay? Because these people are already grown, they have kids, they're in college, and now it's okay to speak up. But there's younger people who are still going through this, who are younger, that I think I said like at the beginning of the book, that this book is for those young people to see that we know this is happening and people need to talk about it. Because if we don't have these uncomfortable conversations, as you said, then it's just going to be as is. A lot of things happen, even with a lot of atrocities in the world historically. People never speaking up about it is why it continued. You have to be able to bring this to the forefront and have these uncomfortable conversations that there are cousins or people who we live with. Even within the African American, the Black community, this happens. They have Black uncles or people who they say, oh, he don't come to the cookout, or we don't invite him because he likes to touch kids. So this is a problem. You never reported him to the cops. You never addressed it. The person who he touched is just going to live with that trauma. So I thought it was important for me to share these stories so that it can become household stories, so that we can have this conversation and people can be aware that this is the reality for some of our young people.
We're not even talking about the mental health impact when we're talking about all these stories, because when you look within our community, you don't know when someone is going through emotional distress. And back home, also in different parts of Africa, in terms of approaching things regarding mental health issue, it's not something that we discuss because we don't believe in it.
Yes.
We have not even advanced to that level to say that we're going to address such situation. From some of the people that you talk to, how were they able to cope with these things? How has it affected their mental health? Have they been able to address it?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, for them, like the self-therapy is being able to talk about it to people now. To be able to speak about it is a little bit of healing, and it makes them feel empowered. But there's also some services now with young people going back to the continent. A lot of young people introducing these conversations. There's some mental health services provided in places, but mostly in the urban areas, obviously, not in the rural parts yet, but most of the big urban areas, people who've moved back from the diaspora, and they're introducing this conversation about it. So they have some services that most times that I share, especially for Liberia, like these are the people who are doing the work. Like, if you need to talk to people, this is people who live here sharing some online resources of where you can go to have this conversation. Because as much as it's nice to write these stories and share them, those people are living with this reality have to talk to people. There's this weight on their shoulders that they still need to let go of and have this conversation, because some of these people are not even having healthy relationships because of these things. So I think it's important that we continue to share resources with them as well.
Yeah. And it's not only the girls that they sexually abusing. What about the boys?
I have a story in there, and it was important for me to do that. That's called Small Peking. I talk about a younger boy being molested by an older woman, and even his parents, everybody just said, stop talking about that. You're a little boy, like almost just brushing it off because he's a boy. But yes, you're right. It is very important. And I think for me, I had to include that because I didn't want it to be a one-sided conversation, because there are young men, a lot of them, even teenagers, that lose their virginity to older people, and we don't call it what it is. We just graze over or sweep it on the rug.
On the rug. One of my podcasts that I recorded, I released also, I think it's the third episode. I spoke to a young man who actually wrote a book about LGBTQ community in Nigeria. And he revealed the stories of different men sleeping with boys, including pastors, husbands, having a relationship and sleeping with young boys.
Wow.
And it's not something that is really talked about, because when we talk about the abuse, we only focus on the girls only, or like you said, only focusing on a young man being molested by a woman. But what about men who also sexually abuse young boys? Most of the time they cannot talk about it. And it's because also the poverty situation in different parts of Africa, whereby the person who is doing the abuse may actually have the financial power over that family, whereby it might be somebody who they highly respect, that actually help the family out once in a while to give them money for their survival. And then if the child comes out and tell the parents or tell the adult, this is what this person is doing to me, they will say, "Osh, osh." How can we say that outside? This is the person who is helping us. So it's also to be able to focus on the poverty situation in different parts of Africa that continue to allow this kind of behavior to go on. So what lesson would you like people to take away from these stories?
I think for me, one of the most important lessons is that this is not an issue that should be discussed in the dark. It's uncomfortable conversation that's much needed in our communities, both in the diaspora and at home. I think for me, the takeaway from the book is that we are robbing young people of their childhood. This is a trauma that's not just a childhood trauma that goes away. This is stuff that live with people throughout their life, with their relationship. It affects how mothers love their kids. It affects how they love their husbands, how young teenagers have boyfriends or not have boyfriends. It affects all parts of our society, not just the family value. It affects how people interact with people. It affects a lot of different people on different levels. And I think for me, one of the key issues for this book specifically was for me to be able to not be the voice of victims, but to amplify their voice, because a lot of them are getting strength. And I think we can't let the perpetrators win, because these people are our uncles, our dads, our mothers, our cousins. They're moving around their business, and these people are still walking around with this trauma. So I think we need to know that we see these people and we acknowledge that this is happening, and it's not okay that it's happening. So I think for me, that was my goal.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So what advice would you offer to a person who have had such offense against them in the past, sexual offense, even traumatic abuse and offense towards them in the past? What advice would you have for them? And what advice would you have for parents? as well?
I think for me, first to the parents is that they need to have these conversations. Sometimes the signs are there. A lot of times African parenting is out of fear and it's not respect. It's like fear because we're afraid to have conversation with our own parents. And because of that fear, we are living in our own darkness. And then we'll get to this country. We think it's privacy, so we stay in our corners. We don't share these things. We're mixed in this two culture of that says, don't tell your parents stuff and don't share too much. I think for parents, we have to open our conversations with our young people, get to know them. As much as you want them to be this great person, as everybody have their own personality. So you should meet them halfway, get to know them and understand. If the signs are not there, ask these questions. Who is this person talking to? Who young person like playing like Baya behind the house, who's now crying, no longer the same, they're walking. Like sometimes people can see these signs that they just keep it. And when you voice out, when the kids have the courage to speak up, don't scold them and say, you're a small child, what do you know about this? Or don't talk about this, your father is speaking. I think we need to give children, not to be disrespectful to their elders, but to give them the opportunity and the platform to speak up. For victims and people, there are a lot of resources, people who follow me online or know me. A lot of times, if I don't know, I'm not afraid to say I don't know, to share these resources because there's people who are doing the work. Like in Liberia itself, there's people who are doing this work. I know of Action Aid Liberia. There's an organization that is doing a lot of work with domestic violence and sexual abuse in Liberia. There's a lot of young people that are doing this work that you need to reach out to and share these resources. And mental health services, I can't stress enough, is very much needed for people like myself that have lived through war situation, that have done so many things that were supposed to just be in the American classrooms and just blend in. It's hard to blend in when you know there are a lot of things that you've lived with and you've seen. So I think we need to seek out mental health practitioner and try to use the services. It should not be taboo. It's not the end of the world. I know it's very expensive, so I recognize the privilege of having that opportunity. But just to seek those services when you have the opportunity to, just like you go to a hospital or the dentist, I think mental health services should be a part of our lives.
Which is very important because when you talk about a mental health issue, or you talk about people seeing therapists or talking to a therapist, many of our people want to run inside the bush and say, what are you talking about? I'm not crazy. And it's part of the education that is needed within our community. I remember listening to one of our youth on the radio one time, and he said, all the African people need in America, they need to be in therapy to be able to talk about their challenges and some of the trauma that many of us went through growing up back home. It's all part of it. How can a listener connect with you online or buy this book?
So the book is on Amazon. It's Baya, B-A-Y-A, Play Cook. The book is on Amazon. You can get a copy on Amazon. For people who are boycotting Amazon, they can send me a message directly, zulekaworld@gmail.com, and I can arrange to have a copy sent to them if you don't want to buy on Amazon. I'm hoping to be in Liberia this summer specifically. That's where I'm going to do the official launching, and because it's important that this book benefit Africa and African people, and proceeds from the book will be going to domestic violence and sexual abuse victims. I think for me, this book is more important that people hear the stories of people and amplify the voices of victims than it about profit. And also, if you're on Facebook or Twitter, I'm Zuleka Tweets. Facebook, I'm Zuleka, and Instagram, I'm just Zuleka there as well. So people can go online and follow me. I share a lot of these conversations that we had today about my experiences living between Africa and America, specifically in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and other West African countries. So that's how people can connect with me.
There was something that struck me with the book too. Who are the Congo people? Or the
those are the name assigned to people who return from the States. So the settlers, the return or enslaved Americans that's in Liberia, their relations in Liberia are known as the Congo people. Those are the non-native Liberians. So my mother is from the Pele tribe. So any non-indigenous Liberian is known as the Congo people.
Yeah, I just remember that. I said, I have to ask you that as well. Yes. So thank you so much. Is there anything else you would love our audience to know? What else do you want to share?
I think people need to continue this conversation, and I'm happy to have this platform. Thank you again for inviting me to this platform. I didn't know Pánsá Pánsá was that. So I think Pánsá Pánsá is very important to have uncomfortable conversations because it's through those conversations that we can learn. So I'm very happy to have this conversation with you, and I look forward to many more connections. I hope a lot of young Africans listening to this continue to share your stories. I think it's a beauty. I say all the time, if I die 10 times and come back, I still want to be African. I hope people understand that it's a privilege and a beauty in being African. We continue to shine our light and tell our own stories. It's important that our stories be told by us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Zuleka, Dauda, for coming to Pánsá Pánsá Live podcast to share stories from your new book, Baya Playbook, and sharing your experience as first-generation African immigrants who grew up in America. As we publicly discuss difficult issues within our community, we're shredding away a stigma associated with uncomfortable dialogue, especially focusing on abuse, rape, molestation of women and children.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Pánsá Pánsá Live podcast. We hope you join us next time. Please continue to subscribe to Pánsá Pánsá Live podcast. Please share as much as possible to our audience, to others, and hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Pánsá Pánsá Live podcast. We hope to have you back with us in the next episode as we continue to explore the nuances of the African immigrant experience. If you'd like to connect with us, you can email us at talk@pansapansa.org. That is talk@pansapansa.org. And follow us on Instagram at pansa.pansaforum. Until next time, remember to spread kindness and love. Thank you and take care of yourself.